I was 18 at the time, and commonly mistaken for being in my early teens. I had just finished running some errands in town, and decided to take a shortcut to catch the bus home. The shortcut was a narrow street, and it opened up to a shopping center's entrance. It was more of a glorified alleyway, but since the street connected onto the high street, it was the quickest way into the shopping center, which meant it usually got a decent amount of foot traffic and was extremely safe to use. However, depending on the time of day, there were only a few, if any, people, and that was the case on this day. Just as I was walking out of the entrance and celebrating the fact that I wasn't blocked by people standing around talking as usual, a young man around my age startled me by stepping out of a small alcove beside the door blocking my path. He said, "Hi there, how are you? Have you been shopping?" The way he had approached me immediately put me off, but the overly familiar, fancy seeing you here sort of tone he was using made me hesitate for a moment, wondering if he was just someone from high school who recognized me and wanted to say hi. All I muttered was yeah, hi, to stall for a moment while I racked my brain for who he could have been. It didn't take me long to confirm that I didn't know someone that was good-looking, fit, blonde, in his 20s with bright blue eyes and a heavy accent. And since I couldn't think of a good reason someone like that would approach me, my socially awkward, non-confrontational past self thought the best way to deal with it was to dodge around him and leave. He didn't let me leave, though. Instead of taking the hint, he immediately started walking in stride with me on the side of the street closest to the road, so I was between him and the side of a building. And when I tried speeding up because I didn't like the feeling of being penned in, he sped up along with me, keeping me between him and the wall. He began asking me questions that seemed innocent enough, but they were all centered around where I was headed, and if anyone was going to be waiting for me. I had asked him to leave me alone once already, and he acted like I hadn't even said anything. So I was ignoring his questions and glancing around, desperately hoping someone else would enter the street as us, in case he didn't react well to being asked a second time. That was when I noticed the second man. He was older, in his late 30s or early 40s. He had dark hair and a short but scruffy beard. His face gave off the kind of expression that tells you might need to be cautious when dealing with this person. I have no idea where he came from. My guess is he was hiding in the alcove on the other side of the door from the blonde, or further down that side of the street out of sight. But now he was walking in line with us, on the opposite side of the road, staring the entire time. I tried not to let either of these men realize I had seen him, while my brain went into overdrive trying to figure out what their endgame was. Were they going to assault me? Surely they wouldn't risk being caught doing that in broad daylight, right outside of a shopping center. Maybe they were just going to rob me. But if they wanted to do that, the blonde could have just grabbed my bag and ran when he had the element of surprise back when he was hiding behind the door. Then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the street was an underground parking garage. The entrance opened up onto the pavement me and the blonde were walking on, and I would have to walk right past it because of the way he was penning me in. It would take him barely any effort to shove me through, and the dark-haired man across the street had been toying with something in his pocket. I was worried if it was a weapon or maybe just his car keys. What if they were planning to drag me in there and into a car? We were very close to the end of the street now. I abruptly dropped back behind the blonde and darted towards the road, waiting to get away from the garage and make a beeline for the end of the street without getting within the arm's reach of the dark-haired man. The blonde immediately darted after me and blocked my path, hurting me back towards the pavement and penning me into the wall so close this time that my arm was almost scraping across it as I walked, all while still trying to talk to me casually as if he had done nothing wrong. They obviously knew the game was up at this point, though when I glanced over at the dark-haired man to check where he was, we locked eyes. He laughed and called out to the blonde in a different language. The best I was able to determine later was that it was Eastern European. He was saying something that made him laugh too, and he really doubled down on his "is anyone going to miss you" questions, while also asking me if I've ever had a boyfriend, or if I've ever kissed a boy, or if I would like him to be my boyfriend. I continued to ignore them, and was panicking more and more as we approached the garage. Fortunately for me, though, the dark-haired man started to lose his patience with the blonde's lack of progress with me. He began snapping at him, presumably demanding he get an answer, because the blonde looked worried, and his tone was getting more and more urgent every time the man spoke to him. Only a few feet from the garage, the dark-haired man, I guess, crossed a line. The blonde suddenly looked furious. He stopped walking, spun around, and started shouting back at him. I immediately took the opportunity to bolt for the end of the street. And although I heard the blonde shout, asking me where I was going, and what I assume was both of them running behind me, I managed to round the corner and lost both by ducking down the next street, and then several more just to be safe. I didn't feel safe enough to go back to my original bus stop, just in case they stayed in the area and saw me. So I headed for one several blocks away. I was on edge and jumping at the slightest thing until I got on the bus I needed and headed home. I tried to report the incident to the police. They weren't particularly interested since neither of these men had put their hands on me, and I had no proof of what I assumed they were planning to do to me. I never heard anything about abductions, assaults, or robberies in that area, so I'm hoping they simply gave up after their plan didn't work with me. I'm glad I was paranoid enough to save myself from that situation, but I do worry sometimes that another girl wasn't as lucky. The story takes place when I was 15 years old. It was around summertime, and my best friend, who we'll call Jay, was staying at my house for the night. We were pretty bored and had nothing to do. Since it was about midnight, and I lived in a pretty safe neighborhood, I suggested to Jay that we should take a walk down to the 24-hour convenience store a few blocks away. She agreed, and I gathered a few bucks and we went on our way. My parents weren't home that night, and if they were, they definitely wouldn't have let us go. We left our house and started to walk down the street. We made it safely to the store and bought ourselves a few things to eat and drink. We left the store and walked back towards my house. About a quarter way back, Jay pointed out that a black compact car had been following us since we left the store. Me being me, I told her she was just being paranoid, and that they probably live around here. It had been a few minutes after, and I'd realized the car was definitely following us. I told Jay that we couldn't go back to my house, in fear that they would know where I lived. I pulled out my flip phone and held it to my thigh. Jay asked what I was doing. I told her that I was taking a picture of the car along with the license plate. Jay suggested that we started to run and cut through some of the backyards to lose the car. I said it was a good idea, and we booked it. Neither of us knew where we were, so we just walked to the end of the street to look at the signs. We found that we were a while away from my house, but it was nothing we couldn't handle. Feeling pretty good that we lost the creep that had been following us, we stopped paying attention to our surroundings, and just got back to the usual talk. We were closer to my house now, and pretty exhausted. That was when the same black car pulled up next to us. The driver's seat window rolled down, exposing a man in his mid-40s. He explained that he needed help with directions, and he asked us to help him. Jay asked the man why he was following us earlier, and told him it was creepy. The man laughed a little and told us that he wanted to ask us for directions, but we ran off before he could stop. Jay walked closer to the car, and I kept my distance. She asked him where he was headed. He said he wanted to get to a friend's house but couldn't find the street. All possible situations were running through my head, and why this guy actually stopped us. As Jay turned away from the car, the man grabbed her by the wrist. Jay pulled away and yelled, "What the F?" The man said he had a gun, and told us to get into the car, and that if we didn't, he'd shoot us. Jay is now standing next to me, and I whispered to her to run. Again, he said, "If you run, I will shoot you." I confidently told him I had a picture of his license plate. Sure enough, the man rolled up his window and drove away. Looking at each other, me and Jay were both thinking what the hell just happened. Knowing that I had a good chance of being kidnapped or worse, I feel pretty lucky, and that man probably didn't have a gun and was just really stupid. This entire scenario happened a few years ago, when I used to take occasional walks alone at night. I used to think very little of it, since I lived in a heavily residential, wealthy area. In other words, on the trail I'd frequent, houses were always within sight. On one such night, shortly into my walk, I saw a figure walking a few hundred feet behind me. Something I knew was immediately odd, considering it was around 10 o'clock at night. At first, I just discounted this, though, since it was a public trail, they could have very well been doing the exact same thing as me, just going for a walk. I counted on for roughly 5 to 10 minutes or so, before looking behind me once more, only to find the same person still trailing me. Keep in mind that at this point, I'd gone through a few turns by now on the trail, meaning it becomes more and more unlikely that the person just happened to be going to the same location. I decided to take odd paths and directions, turning off into gravel and weirder, more roundabout side areas, and they were still following behind me. By the time I was reaching the apex of my journey, passing by the local park, they were maybe less than 60 feet behind me, a distance they easily could have covered in seconds. It was in that moment I decided to call my family. I had researched this and I knew what to do, and believe it or not, the call of course didn't go through. My phone was a recent gift, and the service was not set up properly, meaning that no matter how many times I frantically called at that moment, nothing would happen. In a decision I call back to as one of my best to this day, I acted as if the call had gone through, and was on the phone with my mom, miming out and talking audibly about my location and the person behind me. I started to briefly describe them. Even in the act, I wasn't really able to do so, as I couldn't get a proper view of their face, as if it was somehow shrouded in something. But I did the best I could with what I had. Sure enough, when I turned around again, they were nowhere to be seen. Not that they'd turned off and walked in another direction, but that they just weren't there to begin with. Weeks later, my mom told me that a police officer had come into her work and warned her about abductions that had been happening in our area, specifically for child trafficking and organ trade.